This is Democracy Watch. I'm joined by leading Democratic voting rights attorney in the United States and the founder of Democracy Docket, Marc Elias. Marc, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the most worrisome news out of this legislative session in Texas focuses on Houston's Harris County that voted for Biden over Trump by a 13-point margin. So not exactly some conservative bastion here. Now, House Bill 1750 eliminates the position of election administrator, and Senate Bill 1933 gives the Secretary of State the authority to take over election administration. So what does this mean, and what's the practical effects of these laws?
I mean, people talk a lot about election subversion. If you look it up in the dictionary, this is it, right? This is literally the Republican legislature and the Republican governor deciding that they don't like the way people in Harris County, which, as you point out, is Houston, a very Democratic area of the state, they don't like the way in which they administer elections and they vote. And so what they have done is they have set up a situation here in which, number one, they have hobbled the county's ability to administer elections by doing away with this position of nonpartisan election director. And the second thing is by giving this extraordinary power to a partisan appointee to effectively take over the county and its administration of elections.
Okay, well, I guess the obvious question here is, what could the worst case break glass scenario be with these laws in effect, with these partisan actors now running things?
Sure. So, Republicans like to say that they want to make voting easy and cheating hard. What they've actually done here is make voting hard and administering elections even harder. The worst case scenario is that because they have hobbled Harris County in the way in which it administers elections, they in fact have less good, accessible elections. And wait for it, the Republican Secretary of State then uses that as a pretext to then say, you see, we need to step in and we need to take over here. Yeah. And in close elections, that kind of stuff matters. I mean, remember, this is the same state that Republicans went to the U.S. Supreme Court after 2020 to argue to throw out the election results in 3 other states. So, this is a very worrisome thing in a state that is still Republican, but is trending more and more Democratic over time.
Yeah, and that's how you really know that they drive home the states' rights point, is when one state tries to unilaterally throw out the election results in 4 other states because they weren't happy with the results.
Right, classic federalism.
Yeah. Okay, well, sticking with Texas for a moment, Texas, along with a number of other red states, have passed a bill facilitating the state's exit from the data organization program called ERIC. So what does this mean, and what are the implications of this?
So this is probably the best illustration of right-wing conspiracy theories, election deniers, and Republican officials all winding up together. Because ERIC is a system that Republicans used to love. And by used to, I mean like 3 months ago. They loved ERIC. Why? Because ERIC was a system that allowed states' databases to talk to one another, to remove from the rolls people who had died, people who had moved, people who are no longer eligible to vote. It was a Republican dream, but somehow it got caught up in this crazy online conspiracy that somehow it was being secretly controlled by George Soros. Not true. And therefore, you started to see Republican states leave ERIC. They're literally leaving the system that allows them to effectuate the purges that they are so eager to effectuate.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. If the point of this bill is to purportedly reduce voter fraud, then how could pulling out of that system where this data is shared among states do anything but hinder those states' ability to actually identify instances of fraud?
That's literally the only purpose of ERIC, was to allow states to prevent fraud and mistake and bloat on their voter rolls by letting there be a comparison, so that if Marc Elias was registered in Virginia and then he moved to Texas, the Virginia database and the Texas database would know, okay, we now see him in 2 places. We need to remove him from 1 place. They are literally shooting themselves in the foot over their main talking point because some right-wing conspiracy theorist on the internet told them a lie.
Well, could the motive here be more insidious in the sense that you basically take away the program that was used to kind of prevent this type of fraud, and then it allows more fraud to basically flood the zone, and then you can point to that fraud, that increased amount of fraud, as evidence that there then is fraud, and you have to take all of these crazy measures like allowing partisan officials to take over election administration roles?
Yeah, I do think that there's something to that. I think even short of there being more fraud, because I don't actually think there'll be more fraud, what it does is it allows them to say, well, we don't have any way to know that this isn't fraud. So now we need to adopt, vigilantism by people, by private citizens. We need to adopt these racially discriminatory laws. We need to enable more voter purges because we don't have any other way to do it. Well, the reason you don't have any other way to do it is you exited from Eric, which was the other way to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's a recurring theme here to watch Republicans break something and then point to the thing that they just broke as evidence that government doesn't work and that they need to shrink the size of government, all while not telling you that the only reason it's not working is because when you put incompetent people in charge, that's how things break.
Correct.
So, yeah.
That's well put. They are literally breaking the system so that then they can complain that the system is broken.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's switch gears here to something different. I want to talk about Democracy Docket, which is the outlet that you founded. I think it is one of the single best resources on the internet. So, floor is yours. What is Democracy Docket?
So I created Democracy Docket to be a reliable source of news and information around voting, around elections, and around the courts. And my hope was that we could accomplish three things. Number one, we could help fight disinformation, because if someone goes out there, if Rudy Giuliani goes out there and says, this is what happened in this case, people could go on Democracy Docket, click on the cases page, and they can read not only summaries, but they can read the actual court decisions and what the parties have filed. So they don't have to rely on my opinion or your opinion. They can read it themselves. So the second purpose was to give good progressive information about the challenges that voters are facing, what states are doing, and amplify the good and hopefully amplify the bad so that it can be corrected and called to task by people like you.
Well, you did recently cover some good news on the democracy front that I caught in Democracy Docket. So I do want to cover some of that because I think it's important, given all of the doom and gloom that we usually traffic in politics, to kind of see the good side of it, because there are people like you who are working hard to make sure that good democratic laws are passed. So first, can you talk about the Democracy for the People Act in Minnesota?
Yeah, so I think that Governor Walz said it best the other day. He said, we got political capital to burn political capital. For a long time, Minnesota had divided government. One chamber was Democratic, one was Republican, and Democrats took charge. And boy, they really did a great thing in expanding voting rights in the state. And one of those things they did, as you point out, was the Democracy for the People Act. It was the centerpiece. It allows 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. It establishes automatic voter registration at many state agencies. It permits voters to opt into a permanent absentee voter list, and it strengthens penalties for people who are trying to intimidate voters. One of the things we need states to do is not stand by while voter intimidation takes place, but rather to penalize it. And kudos to the Democrats in Minnesota for that.
Now, moving over to New Mexico, a new law had restored voting rights to individuals with felony convictions upon release from prison. New Mexico also passed a Native American Voting Rights Act. Can you speak on those?
Yeah. So, again, this is a place where you really see Democrats reacting to the failure of Congress to pass federal legislation and doing everything they can to improve it. Earlier this year, the Democratic governor signed House Bill 4, which is, as you say, the New Mexico Voting Rights Act. It is the first omnibus voting law that was enacted in the 2023 session, and it does a whole bunch of stuff. As you point out, it changes the restoration of rights process so that individuals with felony convictions can get their right to vote back upon release from prison. That'll enfranchise 11,000 people. Beyond that, it does a lot for Native American voting rights. It allows for government buildings, for example, to be used as the mailing address for voter registration purposes. As you know, one of the problems that people who don't have reliable at-home mail service experience is, where do they list as their voter registration? It also enacts a law that expands the penalties for intimidating election officials. Again, we are facing a problem of the right wing intimidating voters and election officials, and they took all of that on. Also mandated the use of vote centers, expanded the criteria for returning mail-in ballots. It's just a great law all the way around.
Now, Washington state also passed a new state-level Voting Rights Act. So how does that Voting Rights Act at their state level compensate for the ways that the Supreme Court weakened the federal Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, so I want to compliment the Democrats in Washington state and Governor Jay Inslee, because, one of the things we oftentimes hear is Democratic states say, well, we already have really good voting laws. We already have good voting laws. Washington state, we already have universal vote by mail. What more is there to do? And I always say, there's something more that every state can do. No matter how good you are, you can do it. You can make it even better. And boy, Jay Inslee and the Democrats in Washington proved that right. In light of the weakening of the Voting Rights Act over the last few years, they adopted a state VRA that that requires the pre-clearance of bad voting laws, again, to make sure they don't discriminate and go into effect. And they built upon that to put that in place at the state level. They also banned firearms at polling locations, allow 17-year-olds to vote in primaries if they're going to turn 18 for the general election, which, is a really important thing. If you think about it, someone who's going to be eligible to vote in November of 2024 when they're 18, they should be able to participate in the primary elections, because they should be involved in helping choose those candidates for when they're able to vote in the general election.
Yeah, that's a great point. Mark, in the states where we are seeing these pro-democracy laws being passed, where was it the most needed? Like, which one of these laws is going to have the biggest impact?
So I'd answer that a couple of ways. First is, I think there are states like Connecticut and Delaware, which we didn't mention, that actually had some pretty restrictive voting laws. A lot of, some of these New England states and Mid-Atlantic states didn't have great election laws. Connecticut is poised to create in-person voting for the first time. I'm sorry, an in-person early voting period for the very first time. That's a really big deal. Delaware is moving towards a no excuse vote by mail system, which will be a big deal there. But it's important that these other states, like I said, Washington state in particular, but all of these states that are thought of as having pretty progressive voting laws are still making them better. And Minnesota, I would say, if you had to pick one, I'd say Minnesota wins the 2023 Elias Award for best voter improvement so far.
Great. Well, I'm sure they'll be happy to hear that one. I actually did want to ask about one more, and this was a really high profile one, but do we know when the court might hear a case in New York now that the Democrats will have a true progressive majority for the first time?
So good news, they just did. They just heard argument in that case at the intermediate court, the court between the trial court and the highest court in New York. I'm hoping we'll get a decision there in the next 60 days, and then we have a new progressive majority, hopefully, on the state court of appeals, which is the high court. And I would expect that whatever the intermediate court does will wind up there, with plenty of time for new fair maps for 2024.
Excellent. And that's obviously one that we'll keep a close eye on. So we'll leave it there. With that said, my message to everybody who's watching right now is it is clear that Marc is out there fighting for us. So please, to help him, all we ask is that you go to democracydocket.com. That is his news outlet. Sign up. It's free. It is so easy to understand, and it'll help you stay on top of everything that's happening right from the source here. So I'll put that link right here on the screen. I'll also put it in the post description of this video. And of course, to see more episodes like this, make sure to subscribe to this channel. That link is on the screen as well. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.